Welcome back to another JIDcast. I'm your host, Dina Gidio, and you're listening to the Closer to the Author podcast, the show that allows students to invest in young adult books and the authors who wrote them. From the classroom to the studio to cyberspace, thank you for tuning in. On today's show, we'll be speaking with an author whose books and short stories are taught in classrooms around the country. Her work has earned numerous awards, including, but not limited to, the Scott Odell Award for Historical Fiction, the Judy Lopez Memorial for Children's Literature, and the New Mexico Book Award. Most notably, her books empower young girls and honor individuality. Born in Columbus, Ohio, and joining us today from San Francisco, California, it is my honor to welcome Ellen Klages to our show. So we're going to jump right in. I discovered The Green Glass Sea probably over 10 years ago in my school's library, and it was just the perfect book for our curriculum. And so I was able to get it into the classroom, and I just think it's a very important World War II story for young readers. For people who don't know, it tells the story of two young girls living in Los Alamos, New Mexico, while their family worked on a top secret government program that we now know as the Manhattan Project. So, as you know, my students have written the majority of these questions, and this is what they would like to know. What sparked your interest in writing about this time in history?
I actually started with the green glass and worked backwards. I was researching, I'd been to New Mexico, and I was researching a story that was set there. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if there was an atomic bomb test on the same weekend that the Roswell aliens came down? And so I looked up stuff, and it turns out that there was only one bomb test in New Mexico. And I read a sentence that said that 2,500 acres of desert had turned into glass because of the heat of the bomb. And I had never heard that before. So I went from the glass to the Trinity test to the Manhattan Project to the war. And so, but it all started with the glass.
And can you tell us a little bit about the research process that you went through to put this book together?
I probably did 3 hours of research for every page in that book. So wow. About 1,000 hours of research. It took me 2 years to write the book, and probably about half of that was research, because it was something that A, I didn't know very much about. B, there's a whole lot written about the Manhattan Project and World War II. And C, the people that I was writing about, some of them were still alive when the book came out. And so lots and lots and lots of research. I started with the basics, pretty much the ABCs of both history and physics, and then moved up from there until it got too technical for me, and then I moved on. But you know, I went to Los Alamos. I walked around. I took pictures. Wow. Interviewed people. I took notes about what it smelled like, and what if you're facing one direction, you know, what you would see at different times of the day. And that way, when I got back to San Francisco, I had pictures and I had notes, and I could take myself back there and try to make it come to life for the reader. Curiosity is probably the theme of the book, because a lot of people think art and science are opposites, but Dewey and Suze both come to solving a problem because of their curiosity, just from different points of view. So one comes from an art point of view and says, what happens if I do this? And the other one comes from a science and engineering point of view, but it's the same question. What happens if I do this?
Well, that's great for me. Because I never looked at it like that. And I've been, working with this book for over 10 years. So I appreciate that. I hope my students will as well. Did you know that the first Captain America book, published in March of 1941, just sold for over $3 million?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing with all the comics that I was collecting were from like 1962 to 66 or so. When I thought, okay, what would Suze be doing on a Saturday afternoon? She can't go anywhere. She can't go to the movies. She can't go ride her bike. So I thought, okay, she'd have a bowl of popcorn and she'd be reading comics. what comics would she be reading? And so I went down that rabbit hole of what comics were around in 1944. And I couldn't buy actual copies of any of them because even the cheap ones were like $500 or $600 a piece. So I just looked at lots and lots and lots of pictures. And the whole Shazam Club thing, I had never read Captain Marvel. I didn't know about, and I found this thing and I thought, that's so cool. And then I just started researching Shazam and all the Greek heroes. And then this whole section of the book came out of trying to figure out what comic book a kid would be sitting in the chair reading. And it would be really easy just to go, Seuss had a pile of comic books.
Sure.
But I wanted to know which comic books. And that led to like a third of the book and the whole Shazam Club thing and the way that the girls connected. So you kind of never know where something is going to take you. Dewey and Suze are, I made up. I actually bought a school picture at a garage sale, and it had a big, tall, blonde girl in the back row and a little wiry, dark-haired, curly girl in the front row. And I just thought those two, because I wanted to make them as opposite as possible.
Sure.
And in every way that I could think of, and then have them come together. The only character that's actually based on somebody from my real life is a little bit of Mrs. Gordon, who is sort of very loosely based on my best friend's mother from elementary school.
Nice.
Everything else is, writers are like magpies. You just find something like, oh, it's shiny. And you kind of literally, put it in sometimes literally in a box and sometimes mentally in a box. And you go, I have this little bit of this, and oh, that's a cool fact, and this. And then you have all of this stuff and you think, okay, how can I put this together? How can I use this? And building characters is the same thing. It's like, I wanted one to be short, one to be tall, one to be blonde, one to be dark. I wanted one to be very quiet and the other one to be very loud. And I mean, the trickiest thing I think for me in writing the book is bringing them together, because of course in the beginning they hate each other. And I read so many books as a kid where it's like the two characters hate each other, and then one day they suddenly go, you have green shoes, I have green shoes, now we're best friends forever. And it's so unrealistic. So I had to figure out a way to move them very gently closer and closer and closer until by the end of the book, they're allies and they're friends. And then there's a sequel, and in the second book, they become family. But yeah, that was the trickiest part for me, was starting from here and moving to the center in a realistic way. When I was a kid, all of the books for girls involved sewing or baking or or being very clean and neat, and all of anybody that had an adventure was a boy.
Right.
And so from the very beginning, I thought, okay, I am going to have girls have adventures.
Sure.
I went to a summer camp that was all girls, and so we learned to do things like use a hatchet and chop wood, and there were no boys around, so all of the chores and tasks and everything you learned, all the girls were learning it because there weren't any boys. And I wanted to play with gender roles as much as I could for the 1940s.
Sure.
But I also wanted them to just be themselves, I guess. And Suze reacts much more to the gender roles than Dewey does, although Dewey's the one who's going to the dump and building things and hanging out in the treehouse with the boys and reading The Boy Mechanic.
Right.
So they're both, but Dewey isn't, I don't think, as chafing with the gender roles as Suze is. So yeah, it's definitely something that I want to explore in all of my books. I never want to have a book where somebody is blindly following any kind of traditional roles without question. Suze grows up to be queer, and it's not I mean, she's 12, so
Yeah.
she's 12 and it's in the 40s. So I don't actually know, but that's how I've always assumed that when it's sometime in the late 50s, she figures this out.
But not in any of your books, right? So that was my question.
Well, sort of. There's a Suze and Dewey, Suze has an aunt that appears in the third book, who lives with another woman in San Francisco.
Okay.
So, and she's also a main character in an adult novel called Passing Strange that is 6 queer women.
So when you were writing the book, were you thinking, did you have hopes that it would end up in a classroom, or did you just write it thinking, well, like you're sending a child off, like into the world and it'll be what it'll be?
Honestly, I never thought anybody else would read this book, or certainly nobody would ever publish it. It's a children's book about the atomic bomb. So it's not something that I set out to write for anybody other than me. I just, like I said, I started with the glass, and the more I found out that I couldn't find out anything about the glass, the more curious I got about it. So I just kept digging deeper and deeper. And then I have the coolest job in the world because I get to follow my curiosity anywhere it takes me. So, I would spend 2 weeks researching old comic books and then write about that. And then I would get to go to New Mexico, and I would get to read about the physics of the bomb, and just whatever caught my interest was where I went. And then the fun of it for me is to try to distill. I mean, I have an 11-foot bookshelf of things I did research for, and probably 15 or 16 notebooks. And I had to distill all of that down so that it was a story. And I think that's where the figurative language comes in, is that you start out telling everybody everything that you know because it's so exciting. And then you have, the equivalent of 3 pages about shoelaces. And you have to get that down to like one perfect sentence in order for it to translate to a reader and keep the story going and not bore anybody, because there's some stuff in that book that is going to be fascinating to one person,
right,
and they're going to skip through to the next part in another person. So yeah, my favorite part of the writing process is when I get the first draft done, and it's a big, horrible, messy thing. And then I get to distill it and distill it and distill it. And for me, it's like making a sauce. You start out with a huge saucepan full of vegetables and stuff, and it doesn't taste very good. And the longer you cook it, the more concentrated it gets. And that's my favorite part of writing.
It's been such a pleasure to meet you. Thank you so much for sharing this with my students. I know they're going to be very excited. They worked very hard to prepare for this, and I know that they appreciate it as well. So on behalf of them, they thank you. And we're going to end with a quote by Fran Lebowitz, one of my favorite. Think before you speak and read before you think.
Great.